Winter 2006. The air above West London hung heavy with the scent of rain and diesel, the echo of buses groaning along Ladbroke Grove. Inside a cramped flat, Noel Clarke sat before a flickering television, watching his own name scroll across the closing credits of Kidulthood. For a moment, he couldn't move. The boy from the council estate had just become the voice of a generation. He was born in December 1975, the son of Trinidadian parents who had arrived in Britain seeking opportunity. His mother worked as a nurse, his father as a carpenter. Their home, though modest, was thick with ambition. The faint tang of floor polish, the hum of BBC News, the sharp crackle of fried plantain. From these humble beginnings, Clarke learned two truths. Survival was an art, and stories were its language. In the early years, he trained at the University of North London and the Actors Centre, fighting to be seen in an industry that often refused to see him. Casting directors offered him stereotypes: thug, troublemaker, background shadow. But Clarke wanted more. He began writing his own scripts late into the night, pen scratching through paper as the street outside filled with laughter and sirens. He wasn't waiting for permission anymore. When Kidulthood hit cinemas, British audiences saw something rare, a story about urban youth that felt raw, real, and lived in. Clarke had written it, starred in it, and carved it from the marrow of his own experience. Its soundscape pulsed with grime beats and restless voices, the sound of teenagers racing through London's concrete arteries. Critics were divided, but the streets weren't. Young people lined up, whispering his name like proof that someone had finally told their story. The success brought offers. Clarke went on to create Adulthood, 2008, and later Brotherhood, 2016, completing a trilogy that mapped out the life of a generation, one struggling with violence, loyalty, and redemption. Each film carried the same sound, the constant murmur of the city, a heartbeat made of traffic, shouting, and ambition. He was no longer just an actor. He was a filmmaker, a movement. Midway through this ascent, his charisma caught the attention of television producers. Clarke joined Doctor Who, portraying Mickey Smith, one of the show's first major black companions. The role made him a household name, and suddenly the boy from the estate was walking red carpets. Photographers shouted his name, their camera shutters snapping like rain. He smiled easily, but his eyes often searched for something beyond the flash, perhaps the quiet corners where he still felt like an outsider. It was during this period that he became the poster child for a new era of British cinema. The British Academy of Film and Television Arts took notice. In 2009, Clarke received the BAFTA Rising Star Award, an honor that seemed to cement his place in the industry's future. On that stage under the golden lights, he thanked his mother. She had believed when no one else had. The audience applauded. The air buzzed with optimism. A son of the working class had arrived. But success, as Clarke would later learn, is rarely clean. The higher one climbs, the thinner the air becomes. And in that thin air, where ego and power mix, lines can blur without anyone noticing. The film sets grew larger, the entourages thicker. Colleagues described him as confident, exacting, sometimes harsh. Others saw it differently: disciplined, visionary, unwilling to compromise. The sound motif of his life, the low hum of constant motion, became louder. Every phone call, every meeting, every late-night rewrite was part of a rhythm that refused to stop. This was also when he began mentoring young actors and filmmakers, often speaking about representation and opportunity. For many, he was a symbol of change, a reminder that talent could break barriers. For others, though, shadows began to gather. Small rumors, moments of unease, private conversations that never reached the press. At the time, few paid attention. Noel Clarke was a success story Britain needed, and no one wanted to question it. Yet beneath the applause, something darker stirred. The same intensity that drove his art sometimes left people unsettled. On set, he was known for demanding realism, even in emotionally charged scenes. His approach blurred lines between performance and control. Some admired the results, others quietly stepped back. Still, his career thrived, expanding into production with his company, Unstoppable Film and Television. He was building an empire, shows, films, and opportunities for those who came after him. By 2020, his name had become synonymous with reinvention. From Bulletproof to Viewpoint, he had crafted a reputation as both a performer and a mogul. The sound of applause followed him everywhere: award stages, interviews, charity events. But applause can also drown out warning signs. In every story of ascent, there's a moment when the air shifts, when the echo of admiration begins to sound different, like a note gone slightly off key. For Clarke, that moment was still invisible, just beyond the horizon. The lights still burned bright, the scripts still piled high. But somewhere in the background a whisper had already begun. If you listen closely, you can almost hear it. The faint rustle of papers, the murmur of journalists gathering evidence, the click of a recorder in the dark. It was the sound of a storm forming, quiet at first, then growing louder. Before that storm hits, take a moment to appreciate stories like this one. Deep dives into truth, fame, and consequence. If you value them, like, share, and subscribe to keep this channel alive. Because soon, the man celebrated as a symbol of progress would face a reckoning unlike anything he had written. Spring 2009. The scent of champagne and velvet filled the Royal Opera House as the crowd erupted into applause. Noel Clarke, standing beneath the hot glare of the BAFTA lights, clutched the Rising Star Award in his hand. Around him, cameras flashed in rapid rhythm, a chorus of light marking his coronation. Britain, at last, had found its new cinematic voice. He spoke briefly that night, thanking his mother, his peers, his city. But underneath the polished gratitude, his mind raced with possibility. This was not just recognition, it was validation. For a working-class black man from Ladbroke Grove, standing on that stage was proof that barriers could be broken, that Britain's stories could come from the pavements as much as from the penthouses. The air buzzed with the perfume of success and the faint metallic scent of ambition. The next morning, his name was everywhere. BAFTA's New Hope. From council estate to cinema elite. Headlines framed him as both a symbol and savior, an artist reshaping the landscape of British film. Clarke stepped into the spotlight with confidence, his every gesture suggesting momentum. He wasn't just acting anymore. He was building something larger than himself. He began mentoring, producing, directing, crafting narratives that gave voice to lives often ignored by mainstream cinema. His production company, Unstoppable Film and Television, became a creative hub for stories about resilience and identity. Actors spoke of his drive, his ability to push a set to its limit, his unrelenting demand for authenticity. Some found it exhilarating, others found it exhausting, but all agreed. Clarke had changed the rules. In interviews, he carried the cadence of conviction. He talked about representation, about opportunity, about the responsibility to pull others up once you've climbed. His voice was calm but sharp-edged, each word honed by years of being underestimated. When he spoke, people listened. For many, he embodied the new face of British storytelling: bold, urban, unapologetic. The sound motif of his life, the hum of the city, followed him everywhere. It was in the echo of train tracks outside the film set, in the vibration of phones during late-night script meetings, in the rhythm of the applause that seemed endless. Success had a sound, and it pulsed through everything he touched. Clarke's characters were rarely simple heroes. They were conflicted, flawed, unpredictable. He once said in an interview that he didn't need to believe in perfect people, only in those who try, fail, and try again. The sentiment resonated. It made him human, relatable, magnetic. Yet, quietly, those around him began to sense that his own perfectionism carried weight, an intensity that could shade into something harder, sharper. By 2010, he was directing new projects and writing scripts faster than studios could greenlight them. The industry hailed him as tireless. Behind the scenes, assistants whispered about sleepless nights, sudden tempers, and impossible expectations. On set, his presence dominated. Every light, every line, every frame bent toward his will. To some, that was genius. To others, control. As his reputation expanded, so did his influence. Actors sought his approval. Producers courted his company. Journalists requested profiles that painted him as both provocateur and visionary. The myth of Noel Clarke was being built in real time, a narrative of defiance polished by success. Still, fame is a fragile currency. It buys attention, but not loyalty. When adulthood's success was followed by the ambitious brotherhood, Clarke seemed untouchable. The trilogy had come full circle, and he was celebrated as the chronicler of a generation that had grown up with him. Yet, beneath the applause, subtle fractures appeared. Colleagues drifted away. Partnerships faded quietly. There were murmurs of tension, of outbursts, of moments when boundaries blurred. Nothing public, nothing proven, just the faint static of discomfort behind the noise of acclaim. By 2015, Clarke had become both symbol and brand. His name appeared on panels about diversity. His voice quoted in debates on representation. He lectured with the authority of someone who had earned the right to speak. To many, he was the future. To others, he was beginning to resemble the very system he had once fought against. Commanding, untouchable, surrounded by deference. The motif of sound, the hum that had once symbolized ambition, grew restless, discordant. It was no longer the rhythm of creation, but of tension. Crew members recalled moments of silence between takes that felt charged, almost brittle. The energy on set shifted. Clarke was still respected, still powerful, but the laughter that used to fill the room came less often. Outside the studio walls, however, he remained the face of success. He was a judge for industry awards, a voice for young creatives, a man who had proven that British film could rise from the inner city. In interviews, he smiled easily, spoke of inspiration, and dismissed talk of pressure. But there was a certain tightness in his smile, a flicker that suggested he was already bracing against something unseen. By 2019, he stood at the height of his career. His series, Bulletproof, co-created with actor Ashley Walters, had become a hit for Sky. Audiences adored its blend of action, humor, and camaraderie. It showed another side of Clarke, confident, witty, commanding. He had everything he'd ever dreamed of. Success, acclaim, stability. Yet, the higher the stage, the longer the fall. It is often said that sound travels farther in still air. In the quiet that followed his biggest triumphs, faint murmurs began to drift. Stories whispered at rap parties, confessions shared between friends, discomfort recounted in private messages. The hum of his success began to merge with a different frequency, that of unease. For now, though, the applause still drowned it out. The world saw only the image he projected, a man of purpose, energy, and relentless drive. But within the industry, a few had already started to look away when his name came up, unsure how to reconcile the icon with the stories they'd begun to hear. The city hummed on, indifferent. Fame, like sound, fades unless constantly renewed. And somewhere beyond the bright lights of premiere nights, a question waited to be asked, one that would soon shatter everything he had built. Autumn 2019. The late-night corridors of a London studio echoed with the low rumble of equipment being packed away, metal clanking against concrete. The faint smell of burnt coffee lingered in the air, mixing with the tang of sweat and exhaustion. Production had wrapped for the day, but Noel Clarke remained behind, pacing near the monitors, reviewing footage. For most of the crew, the day was over. For him, it never truly ended. He had built his reputation on discipline, on control. Everything had to move to his rhythm, the pacing of a scene, the angle of a lens, the tone of a line. He was the kind of director who could spot a misplaced breath. That precision made him formidable. Yet within that precision, there was something else. An energy that could shift from inspiration to intimidation without warning. To outsiders, he was still the picture of composure, the success story who had made it from nothing, the artist who spoke of giving others a chance. But on the inside, cracks had begun to appear in the image. Crew members whispered that he could be volatile, cutting, quick to anger. Others said he blurred boundaries, confusing leadership with domination. Nothing had yet reached the press. These were private murmurs shared between colleagues, sealed behind non-disclosure agreements and professional silence. The sound motif returned here, the hum of the set, the restless buzz of lights overhead. For those around him, that sound carried weight. When Clarke walked onto the floor, conversation softened. Assistants straightened. He demanded total focus, and he got it. But the silence that followed when he left was almost a relief, a collective exhale. At first, these were dismissed as the normal tensions of a demanding industry. Film sets, after all, breed intensity. But a pattern began to form. There were moments when jokes turned uncomfortable, when his remarks veered too close to personal. Laughter followed, but it was nervous. Someone would change the subject. Another would leave the room. A few avoided him entirely, choosing distance over confrontation. For the women who worked near him, experiences varied widely. Some described mentorship, opportunity, and genuine support. Others recalled interactions that unsettled them, comments about their appearance, uninvited touches, a sense that saying no might have consequences. Many stayed silent, afraid of losing work or being labeled difficult. Clarke's influence was strong, and his reputation at that time untouchable. The creative industry in Britain was small. Word spread, but rarely publicly. Stories stayed behind closed doors, shared only among trusted peers, whispered in the corners of rap parties or late-night gatherings. There was always uncertainty. No one wanted to believe that the man who had opened doors for so many could be the same man who made others feel trapped behind them. The tension wasn't constant. It came in flashes, moments that passed before anyone could name them. Clarke himself seemed unaware of how his behavior landed. Those close to him said he was blunt, not cruel, intense, not predatory. But perception can be a weapon all its own. For every colleague who called him a mentor, there was another who quietly declined future collaborations. In the press, however, none of this existed. Clarke remained the industry's favorite redemption arc, a self-made visionary who had turned grit into gold. Interviews painted him as focused, principled, charmingly direct. When asked about criticism, he shrugged it off, saying he only cared about truth on screen. His voice, confident and smooth, carried across radio studios and podcasts. He was the definition of composure. Yet, behind that poise, there was restlessness. He had begun to feel cornered by expectation. Every project had to outdo the last. Every statement had to represent something bigger than himself. He wasn't just Noel Clarke anymore. He was a symbol. And symbols, once lifted high, are rarely allowed to stumble. By 2020, Clarke was juggling multiple productions and corporate partnerships. His name appeared in headlines beside words like trailblazer and visionary. But fame, like light, casts shadows. The louder his public success grew, the more privately those shadows deepened. People began to talk, first quietly, then with conviction. Former colleagues who had once brushed off discomfort now connected experiences. One story led to another. Patterns formed, and somewhere in a newsroom, a journalist began to take notes. The hum of success that had defined Clarke's career began to change pitch. It was no longer the steady thrum of creation. It carried an edge, an undertone of unease. When he looked into the lens now, something in his eyes had shifted. A flicker of caution, perhaps even fear. Still, the public saw only the performance. The confident artist, the devoted father, the industry advocate. Applause continued to follow him into every interview and premiere. But in the spaces in between, in dressing rooms, on message threads, in quiet after-parties, something was moving beneath the surface. For those watching closely, it was clear the story was no longer about rise but about pressure, about what happens when power, perception, and personality collide. The set lights still burned bright, but their warmth had turned harsh. The whispers that once died in the corners of film sets were beginning to reach beyond them. Soon, those whispers would find their way into print, each one carrying the weight of years of silence. The world that had celebrated Noel Clarke's voice was about to listen to others instead. Spring 2021. London's air was cool but tense, the kind of chill that carries electricity beneath stillness. In a newsroom tucked away near King's Cross, journalists scrolled through notes, transcripts, and statements, stories that had been whispered for years but never written. The hum of computers filled the silence. Every keystroke, every saved file felt like a step closer to something irreversible. The sound motif deepened here. That hum now took on a sharpness, like static before a storm. For months, reporters had followed trails of messages, interviews, and anonymous testimonies. Each voice painted a fragment of the same picture, one that contrasted starkly with the public image of Noel Clarke, the celebrated actor, writer, and director who had become a beacon for British diversity in film. By April 2021, The Guardian had gathered over 20 women who alleged misconduct, claims of harassment, unwanted touching, and verbal abuse that stretched across nearly 2 decades. Their accounts varied in detail but resonated in tone. Power imbalance, fear of career repercussions, and a culture of silence. These were not courtroom documents but human recollections, raw, painful, and specific. Each voice carried a cost. When the story broke, it struck with the force of an earthquake. Clarke had just been honored with a BAFTA Outstanding Contribution to British Cinema award only days earlier. The timing made the revelations feel almost cinematic, like the abrupt collapse of a set moments after the spotlight faded. The BAFTA board, blindsided, suspended both his award and his membership almost immediately. Across the industry, the response was a stunned kind of disbelief. Colleagues who had praised his drive now issued cautious statements. Others withdrew entirely. Production companies froze ongoing projects. Broadcasters paused reruns. The hum that once signaled creative energy now signified panic, an unspoken acknowledgement that the narrative had turned. For many of the women, this was not vindication, but exposure. Some chose anonymity. Others spoke publicly, their names joining a movement larger than one man. The allegations were detailed, describing behavior on and off set, comments about bodies, propositions masked as jokes, physical contact without consent. Some described emotional manipulation, others professional intimidation. Clarke, through representatives, denied every accusation. In interviews and legal statements, he portrayed himself as blindsided, insisting that his career was being destroyed by falsehoods. "I vehemently deny any sexual misconduct or wrongdoing," he said through his legal team. The denial was swift and absolute. Public reaction split sharply. Some called it a reckoning, long overdue in a field where influence often blurred moral boundaries. Others questioned the timing, the process, the lack of trial. The debate rippled across social media, hashtags and headlines reducing complex truths into sides. Yet, beneath the noise, something more personal was shifting. The trust once given freely to a beloved figure had fractured. Inside the industry, fear and self-reflection mingled. Former collaborators reevaluated memories. Was that comment inappropriate? Was that behavior normal for the time? The line between mentorship and manipulation had never seemed thinner. The culture that had once celebrated bold personalities was now confronting what had been tolerated in silence. Clarke, meanwhile, vanished from public view. His projects were shelved. His production company, Unstoppable, saw partnerships severed. Former allies stepped back. Friends stopped answering calls. The sudden isolation was total, and for a man used to control, it was unbearable. Journalists continued to publish follow-ups. More women came forward. No criminal charges were filed at the time, but the professional impact was devastating. His name, once synonymous with breakthrough and representation, had become shorthand for betrayal and downfall. In interviews that followed months later, Clarke spoke of his pain, his confusion, his loss. He said he had been canceled without trial. To his supporters, that phrase echoed with injustice. To others, it sounded like denial. The truth, like the hum that threaded through his story, was layered and discordant. The British film community found itself split between two truths: the tangible achievements of a man who had changed the landscape of opportunity, and the lived experiences of women who said they had been diminished in that same space. Both realities coexisted, refusing to cancel each other out. Legal silence followed. There were no charges, no courtroom scenes, no verdicts. But in the court of public opinion, the decision had already been rendered. Clarke's career, once unstoppable, was frozen in time. The man who had fought so hard to tell his own stories was now trapped inside one he couldn't control. As weeks turned to months, one question began to rise from the noise. How could so many have seen the brilliance but not the warning signs? It wasn't just about Clarke anymore. It was about an industry that had chosen to look away. The hum of the newsroom faded, replaced by the soft clatter of headlines spreading across screens worldwide. The words that once praised his rise now chronicled his fall. In their echoes lay the realization that fame and accountability often arrive too late, too unevenly, and too publicly to resemble justice. And yet, beyond the headlines, in private corners of the industry, whispers continued, not only about what had happened, but about what might come next. For every fall from grace, there is always a question of redemption. The next chapter would test whether that redemption was even possible. Summer 2021. London's heat lay heavy across the city, thick and unmoving. Inside a modest office overlooking the Thames, Noel Clarke sat surrounded by silence. The blinds were half closed, the air stale with the scent of dust and coffee gone cold. Outside, life continued. Buses rumbled, pedestrians hurried past, but for him, time had slowed to a crawl. The hum that once followed him through sets and premieres was gone. What remained was stillness, edged with shame and disbelief. Days earlier, every professional bridge he'd built had either burned or been pulled away. His television projects, Bulletproof, Viewpoint, and others, were suspended or canceled outright. Production partners cited serious allegations. Actors he had once championed distanced themselves in careful statements. Streaming services deleted his work without ceremony. He had been erased faster than he could respond. For an industry that once cheered his rise, the reversal was swift. Clarke's name became a warning whispered in production offices, a cautionary tale of power and its collapse. The industry was changing, recalibrating itself under the scrutiny of the post-Me Too world. What might once have been managed quietly now unfolded in public view. The sound motif, once a hum of creative life, became the faint mechanical buzz of his phone lighting up with notifications. Messages from colleagues alternated between sympathy and avoidance. Some simply wrote, "I can't be seen talking to you right now." Even friends hesitated. Clarke had become radioactive. He issued statements, all carefully worded, all firm in denial. He acknowledged that he might have made others uncomfortable but denied any intent to harm or abuse. He spoke of losing everything, career, reputation, community, without ever being charged. To him, this was exile without trial. To others, it was accountability delayed too long. The court of public opinion didn't wait for proof. It didn't need to. The story had captured something larger than one man's actions. It had become a mirror for an entire industry as complicity. Networks issued apologies. Unions promised reviews. BAFTA admitted it had been warned before honoring Clarke, but said there hadn't been enough evidence to act. Those words, "not enough evidence," rang like a dirge through every creative circle in London. For the women who had come forward, the reckoning was equally complex. Some found solace in being believed. Others felt exposed, questioned, and re-traumatized. Tabloids combed through their social media. Anonymous voices accused them of career sabotage. The cost of speaking out was high, even in the supposed era of accountability. The legal system, however, remained quiet. The Metropolitan Police confirmed that reports had been received, but that there was insufficient evidence to pursue criminal charges. To many, that announcement created a strange vacuum. Clarke was neither convicted nor cleared. His reputation was in ruins, but the law offered no closure. Behind closed doors, industry professionals debated what this meant. Could a man fall so completely without a formal charge? Could silence and testimony weigh more than verdicts? The questions had no simple answers. What was clear, however, was that the trust once given to celebrity was being redefined. For Clarke, isolation became routine. He stopped leaving the house except for short drives. Former collaborators described him as subdued, often unrecognizable from the fiery, confident figure they once knew. Some said he appeared haunted. Others said he was plotting a return, unwilling to accept the story as finished. Weeks turned into months. Headlines moved on, yet the stain remained, indelible. For every story that replaced his name lingered like a footnote in the conversation about accountability and representation. The irony was sharp. His legacy as a trailblazer for inclusion now forever tied to allegations of abuse. In private, he recorded hours of voice memos, fragments of thought, apologies mixed with anger, confusion intertwined with self-pity. He spoke about betrayal, about hypocrisy, about the brutality of the media. In one, he said quietly, "I was their hero until they needed a villain." That sentence echoed what many disgraced figures before him had felt. The belief that fame offers immunity until the audience decides it doesn't. Yet, beneath the defiance, there was something else. Loss. The loss of identity, purpose, and control. For a man who had built his career on telling stories, he had become one. Across the creative world, the fallout continued. Studios reviewed harassment policies. Industry bodies introduced confidential reporting channels. Training programs addressed power dynamics and consent. Clarke's case became an example in legal seminars, ethics workshops, and quiet internal memos. It wasn't just a scandal, it was a study in systemic failure. Still, amid all the condemnation, there were those who hesitated. A few colleagues whispered that cancel culture had gone too far, that men were being destroyed by accusations alone. Others countered that silence had been protected for too long. Between these poles of outrage and defense, the truth seemed suspended, unreachable. For Clarke, the reckoning was not just public, it was personal. Each morning, he confronted the emptiness of a reputation dismantled. The mirror reflected a man stripped of certainty. No scripts, no sets, no applause, only questions. By late 2021, he had given up interviews. The silence that followed was different now, not protective, but hollow. The hum had gone entirely. What replaced it was the distant murmur of an industry moving on without him. But history has a way of circling back. Scandals fade, but they never vanish. Somewhere, editors and producers still asked the forbidden question: could he ever return? Could talent outweigh controversy? Those questions, though whispered, would shape the next act of his story. Because even after the reckoning, the world never truly decides whether to forgive or simply to forget. Winter 2022. London's streets were damp, the smell of wet asphalt and exhaust thick in the evening air. Noel Clarke walked alone along narrow alleys, his coat pulled tight, hood casting shadows across his face. The city had not changed, but he had. The hum that once pulsed with opportunity and applause was replaced by the faint murmur of caution, the sound of doors quietly closing, of whispers in hallways, of opportunities that would never arrive. After the storm of allegations in 2021, Clarke's world had contracted. He no longer received scripts, no longer attended premieres, no longer appeared on panels. Calls from producers went unanswered, emails left unopened. It was the kind of isolation few imagine until it hits. The sudden evaporation of a career built on visibility, recognition, and influence. Even familiar faces now avoided him in public. The silence was deafening. Yet, in that vacuum, survival became imperative. Clarke retreated into work that could be done privately, writing, reviewing scripts, sketching ideas for future projects. His home became both sanctuary and prison, the walls filled with notes, half-finished screenplays, and awards that now felt heavy, like relics of another life. Every room carried the faint metallic scent of his ambition, now tinged with regret. Behind closed doors, he meticulously documented everything: emails, text messages, meeting notes, an archive of his career and contacts. Some say he was preparing for legal battles. Others believed he was simply trying to retain a sense of control in a world that had stripped it from him. Even in solitude, Clarke's life followed the rhythm of the hum, his own heartbeat echoing in the stillness. The legal system had remained largely silent, but Clarke was aware of the scrutiny. The Metropolitan Police had reviewed the allegations and determined there was insufficient evidence for criminal charges, leaving him in a liminal space, neither cleared nor condemned. That ambiguity hung over him like the smell of wet concrete, persistent and inescapable. Public opinion, however, had already passed judgment. Clarke's professional exile was accompanied by personal reflection. Friends described long nights of pacing, talking to himself, trying to reconcile the image of the man he had been with the one the world now saw. He oscillated between anger, sadness, and disbelief. The same intensity that had driven him to create now drove him inward until the walls seemed to close in. Attempts to engage with the media were minimal and carefully orchestrated. Every word mattered. Every misstep could reignite controversy. Clarke learned to speak softly, selectively, and with a careful eye on perception. The lessons were harsh. Fame could vanish overnight. Influence could be weaponized against you. Silence could become your shield and your prison simultaneously. Meanwhile, those who had once collaborated with him were caught in a balancing act: sympathy, caution, or avoidance. Producers feared reputational damage. Actors feared association. The hum of collaboration that had once energized Clarke's life was now a vacuum, replaced by isolation and the echo of missed opportunities. He began to focus on his own resilience. Fitness routines, long walks through empty streets, and hours spent alone in thought became rituals. He meticulously analyzed past interviews, every public interaction, and every on-set anecdote to understand how perception had shifted so rapidly. Survival, he realized, was less about visibility and more about endurance, learning to exist in a world that no longer wanted him in it. During this period, Clarke also reflected on the women who had spoken out. Some felt guilt, some outrage, others confusion. He claimed he had never intended harm, yet he began to confront uncomfortable questions about power, boundaries, and responsibility. Even in silence, the consequences of influence were inescapable. By late 2022, Clarke's life had taken on the cadence of shadows. Public recognition faded. The hum that had once followed him everywhere became almost imperceptible. And yet, beneath the quiet, there was preparation. A slow, meticulous gathering of resources, strategies, and legal counsel. Survival in exile demanded patience, observation, and calculation. The industry, meanwhile, continued forward without him. Policies changed. Discussions about accountability intensified. New voices emerged, reshaping norms, insisting on transparency. Clarke's absence became part of that narrative, a cautionary tale of fame, unchecked power, and the consequences of silence. Still, in private, Clarke nurtured hope. Perhaps the world would change again. Perhaps opportunities would return. He knew that any resurgence would require strategy, patience, and an ability to navigate both legal and social perception. The hum of ambition had not entirely died. It had merely shifted into a lower, steadier tone. In these moments of quiet survival, Clarke understood the fragility of legacy. One misstep, one allegation, one moment of unguarded behavior could undo decades of work. The city outside carried on, oblivious to the exile within its streets. But in the hum of streetlights, the clatter of trains, and the distant chatter of passers-by, he sensed that time was still moving, and the next chapter, however uncertain, had yet to arrive. Spring 2023. The London courthouse loomed over cobblestone streets damp from overnight rain, its stone walls heavy with history and whispered judgments. Inside, Noel Clarke walked with measured steps, the faint smell of mildew and old leather filling the air. For the first time in years, he would confront the media directly, not with interviews, not with deflections, but in the controlled environment of a courtroom. The hum that had once been applause now thrummed with tension and anticipation. After months of legal preparation, Clarke had launched a libel lawsuit against The Guardian, claiming that their 2021 reporting had been defamatory. His argument was precise. The allegations were exaggerated, selectively presented, and had destroyed his career unfairly. Every statement, every quote, every piece of evidence was meticulously catalogued. Clarke's team aimed to show that the newspaper Emure narrative had been constructed with an agenda rather than impartiality. The courtroom was a theater of contrasts. On one side, journalists, legal experts, and the press observed with quiet intensity. On the other, Clarke's legal team laid out a case of reputational destruction, punctuated by documents, witness statements, and timelines. The hum of the room, the scrape of pens, the shuffle of paper, the quiet breathing of those waiting, carried a weight all its own. Throughout the proceedings, Clarke maintained composure. He wore dark suits, simple ties, and an expression that blended resolve with exhaustion. For him, the trial was not just legal, it was existential. The world had judged him publicly, but here, in this courtroom, he sought validation from a system bound by rules rather than sentiment. The newspaper defended its reporting rigorously. Editors testified about the verification process, fact-checking methods, and ethical standards. They outlined the extensive research, interviews, and corroborations behind the story, emphasizing that the women's testimonies were independently verified. Each document presented by the defense added weight to their claim. Clarke's actions, they argued, were consistent with the accounts published. The witnesses were pivotal. Former colleagues, producers, and crew members recounted experiences that had been private until now. Some spoke of discomfort on set, of moments when Clarke's intensity felt controlling or inappropriate. Others emphasized his creative genius but acknowledged that his behavior had sometimes crossed boundaries. Every voice contributed to a layered portrait. A man, both gifted and flawed, whose public persona had shielded private tensions. For Clarke, cross-examination was grueling. Lawyers pressed him on text messages, past remarks, and interactions that had been previously unknown to the public. He answered with care, often pausing to consider phrasing, but the relentless scrutiny wore at him. The air in the courtroom was thick with anticipation, each exchange punctuated by the faint tapping of shoes or the low murmur of observers shifting in their seats. Outside the courthouse, the press swarmed. Headlines were drafted in real time. Actor fights, allegations in court, Noel Clarke versus The Guardian, public figure challenges media narrative. Social media erupted with commentary, dividing audiences once again. Supporters framed the lawsuit as a fight for justice and free expression. Critics framed it as an attempt to rewrite history. Clarke's life, like before, was being dissected under unforgiving scrutiny. Weeks passed. The court sessions stretched into months. Evidence, both new and old, was dissected. For Clarke, each day was a careful balancing act. Defend, maintain composure, and project credibility while privately navigating the emotional toll of reliving allegations that had already upended his life. The line between performance and truth blurred. He was both defendant and character in a story being written by the world around him. By mid-2023, observers noted a shift in tone. Clarke's team argued that reputational harm had been extreme, emphasizing lost contracts, canceled projects, and severed industry relationships. They contended that even if some allegations had factual basis, the overall depiction in the press had been sensationalized. The defense countered with meticulous documentation, witness testimonies, and prior statements that reinforced the published narrative. The courtroom, heavy with silence between testimonies, felt almost like a theater. Each statement, each objection, each legal motion carried weight far beyond the room. For Clarke, it was a final attempt to reclaim control, a structured arena where rules could govern outcomes. Outside, however, the hum of public opinion continued, louder than ever, unyielding, impossible to ignore. As the trial concluded and the case moved toward judgment, Clarke faced the undeniable truth of litigation. No matter the outcome, the process itself had reshaped his life irrevocably. He had fought, yes, but the battle exposed every fault line, every fracture in public perception, every lingering shadow from past decisions. The hum of his career, once steady and vibrant, now echoed as a distant resonance of something lost. The verdict would determine not just the outcome of a lawsuit, but the trajectory of a career suspended in uncertainty. Clarke's professional identity, his personal reputation, and the way the world would remember him were all entwined in the scales of the High Court. Outside, London carried on. Traffic rattled over bridges. Street vendors shouted over the hum of city life. Life, as it always does, pressed forward, indifferent to the struggles of one man in a courtroom. Yet, for those within, the moment felt decisive. The culmination of years of acclaim, whispers, and controversy converging in a single, inexorable reckoning. Autumn 2023. The courtroom smelled of polished oak and faint mildew, a scent that clung to clothing and lingered in the throat. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the benches where journalists, lawyers, and spectators waited. Noel Clarke entered, moving deliberately, the quiet click of his shoes against the stone floor echoing like a metronome. The hum of anticipation was almost tactile, pressing against every person in the room. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Lawyers shuffled papers, whispered across tables, and tapped keyboards quietly. Each movement seemed magnified under the scrutiny of the gallery. Clarke's eyes scanned the room, registering every expression: faces of support, skepticism, curiosity, and judgment. The sound motif of his life, once the vibrant hum of applause and studio lights, had shifted into a brittle tension that thrummed in the air like a tight wire. The proceedings began with opening statements. Clarke's counsel outlined the case, that the Guardian had defamed him, publishing unverified allegations that had caused irreparable damage to his career and reputation. The voice was steady, deliberate, measured, as if every word were a brick in a wall defending him from the storm outside. Clarke listened, nodding occasionally, absorbing the narrative being built on his behalf. Next, the defense presented their case. Editors described rigorous fact-checking procedures, corroborated testimonies, and meticulous research. Witnesses recounted interactions with Clarke, their voices measured but firm, illustrating a pattern of behavior that aligned with the allegations previously reported. Each narrative layered complexity into the picture of the man once celebrated for his vision, charisma, and influence. Cross-examination was relentless. Clarke was asked to respond to text messages, production notes, and accounts from former colleagues. Each question demanded precision. Hesitation could be interpreted as admission. His tone was calm, though fatigue threaded through his responses. Outside the courtroom, journalists followed every motion, capturing expressions, pauses, and reactions that would feed public perception for months. The women who had shared their experiences were central to the proceedings. Some spoke in person, others provided written testimony. Their voices carried the weight of lived experience. They described moments of discomfort, intimidation, and manipulation, sometimes amplified by the power dynamics of a successful actor and filmmaker. Every statement built on the narrative that Clarke's professional authority had sometimes crossed personal boundaries. Clarke's team countered with evidence of mentoring, support, and positive references from colleagues who testified to his professionalism and creative genius. The courtroom was a delicate balance of narratives. He was both visionary and alleged wrongdoer, celebrated figure and isolated defendant. The hum of tension threaded through every exchange, a reminder of the stakes beyond legal arguments: public perception, legacy, and career survival. During recesses, Clarke sat quietly, reflecting on the years that had led him here. The first film he wrote, the awards he received, the applause, the mentorship, all of it now refracted through the lens of accusation and legal scrutiny. He jotted notes, sometimes for his legal team, sometimes for himself, as if cataloging memories to prove they had meaning beyond the headlines. The media coverage was unrelenting. Outside the courthouse, camera shutters clicked incessantly, the distant murmur of reporters forming an unbroken wave of observation. Social media conversations dissected each motion, each expression, each minor slip. Clarke's public persona was being evaluated in real time, with millions acting as both jury and audience. The hum of life had returned to its harsh, relentless frequency. Inside, moments of quiet reflection were punctuated by tension. Lawyers leaned over tables, whispering strategies. Witnesses adjusted in their seats, waiting for questions that could change the trajectory of the case. Clarke remained composed, though behind his measured expression, the weight of isolation, public scrutiny, and professional uncertainty pressed heavily. By the final days of testimony, the case had become a mirror reflecting the complexity of fame and accountability. Clarke's achievements, once unambiguously celebrated, were now inseparable from the allegations. Every success was re-examined, every public appearance reconsidered. In that room, past and present collided with palpable force, creating a narrative far larger than the man at the center of it. As the judge prepared to hear closing arguments, Clarke sat back, listening to the soft murmur of the courtroom. Every rustle of paper, every faint cough, every whisper was amplified in the quiet. He understood that this moment, this legal theater, was more than a trial. It was a reckoning of identity, reputation, and consequence. Outside, the city moved on, indifferent to the drama within. But inside, every sound, every gesture, and every word carried the weight of years of ambition, conflict, and human complexity. And when the final arguments concluded, one truth remained clear. Regardless of the verdict, nothing would ever restore the world to the simplicity it had known before the allegations emerged. Winter 2023. Outside the courthouse, the wind carried the sharp tang of wet stone and diesel. Passers-by hurried along cobblestones, barely noticing the cluster of reporters, camera crews, and activists gathered at the gates. Social media feeds vibrated with commentary, hashtags, and heated debate. The hum of London's streets had transformed into the staccato buzz of public judgment. The moment Clarke stepped outside, his presence ignited conversation. For supporters, he remained a misunderstood artist, a visionary whose career had been dismantled without a trial. They cited his creative contributions, his pioneering voice in British cinema, and the opportunities he had created for emerging talent. Online threads praised his skill, emphasizing that allegations alone should not erase decades of achievement. Yet critics were equally vocal. For many, the allegations confirmed what had long been whispered behind closed doors. They framed Clarke not as a victim of sensational reporting, but as a man whose success had shielded a pattern of misconduct. To them, public accountability was inevitable and overdue. Social media amplified these narratives, and opinion polls suggested that a significant portion of the public had already aligned with this perspective, regardless of ongoing legal proceedings. Journalists chronicled every nuance. Headlines alternated between sympathy and condemnation, and the courtroom itself became a theater of public fascination. Commentators debated the balance of due process and moral reckoning. Podcasts dedicated entire episodes to dissecting the trajectory of Clarke's career, his rise and fall, and the tension between talent and accountability. Each analysis carried the hum of cultural scrutiny, a reminder that in the modern age, careers are judged as much by public perception as by legal outcome. The shift was palpable within the industry as well. Colleagues previously silent began issuing cautious statements, some expressing regret for past collaborations, others asserting support from a distance. Producers and studios reconsidered past endorsements, awards ceremonies reviewed protocols, and mentorship programs initiated internal discussions about boundaries, consent, and power dynamics. Clarke's case became a lens for institutional reflection, a benchmark for the handling of misconduct allegations in creative industries. The sound motif, the constant hum of tension, permeated social discourse. Public debate was relentless. Every social media post, every televised panel, every comment in print contributed to the vibration of judgment. The line between news and spectacle blurred, making it nearly impossible to separate fact from interpretation. Clarke, once the center of applause, now occupied a space defined by suspicion and scrutiny. Public rallies and advocacy campaigns also emerged, highlighting broader issues of workplace behavior in the film and television sectors. Women's groups praised the courage of those who came forward, emphasizing systemic change. The conversation expanded beyond Clarke himself, questioning long-standing practices, mentorship structures, and hierarchical power imbalances. His individual actions became inseparable from institutional critique. For Clarke, the shift in public opinion was palpable but intangible. He watched from the shadows as support and condemnation clashed in cyberspace. Messages from friends were fewer, and those that arrived were cautious, measured, and indirect. Even admirers tempered praise with disclaimers. The hum of approval he had known for years had diminished, replaced by the static of uncertainty. Traditional media outlets, sensitive to public sentiment, moderated coverage carefully. Commentaries dissected prior films, interviews, and awards, often reframing them through the lens of the allegations. Fans revisited his work with skepticism, asking whether art could be separated from the artist. Each revisit altered perceptions, even for those who had previously idolized him. By mid-2023, Clarke's presence in the public consciousness was defined less by his creative output than by the controversy surrounding him. Discussions in professional circles, social media debates, and journalistic analyses formed a chorus. Some voices sympathetic, some harsh, all unyielding. It became clear that the court of public opinion was, in many ways, more consequential than any legal proceeding. Even as Clarke prepared for legal resolutions, he faced an inescapable reality. Perception had shifted permanently. Fame, once a tool of influence, had become a lens of scrutiny. Achievements, once celebrated, were now interrogated, and the hum that had accompanied him from the council estates of West London to the stages of BAFTA had transformed into a relentless vibration, a reminder that reputation, once fractured, is nearly impossible to restore fully. In this charged atmosphere, Clarke began to understand the scope of his fall. No courtroom verdict, no statement, no public defense could entirely reverse the collective judgment forming online and in professional circles. The narrative of his life had moved beyond his control, shaped instead by voices once peripheral, now central, and by a society increasingly unwilling to separate art from accountability. And yet, amidst this turbulent climate, some threads of support remained. Advocates continued to call for due process. Some peers quietly acknowledged past contributions. and a few media commentators cautioned against erasing decades of achievement. The hum persisted, fragmented, uneven, unpredictable, an echo of a man suspended between his past prominence and the uncertain path ahead. The next chapter would explore the personal consequences, the quiet battles behind closed doors, and the endurance required to survive in the aftermath of public reckoning. Spring 2024. The air in Noel Clarke's flat was heavy with the faint scent of damp paper and unwashed laundry, the remnants of long nights spent pacing, reviewing documents, and reflecting on what had been lost. Outside, London stirred with indifferent energy. Buses rattled, trains clattered across tracks, and pedestrians moved past without pause. Inside, silence prevailed, punctuated only by the faint hum of a radiator and the occasional echo of his own voice as he rehearsed statements and responses in the mirror. The personal consequences of the allegations and the ensuing public reckoning were profound. Clarke's relationships, once a source of support and stability, had frayed. Friends and colleagues, unsure of how to navigate the tension between loyalty and reputation, pulled back. Family remained, but even they approached cautiously, aware of the scrutiny their association could invite. Loneliness, once an occasional companion, became a constant presence. The physical toll was evident. Insomnia followed him through nights thick with anxiety, the racing thoughts rendering sleep elusive. Meals became irregular, sustenance taken more out of routine than appetite. The bright energy he once carried onto film sets had dulled, replaced by a measured, cautious presence that seemed to weigh each action against potential consequences. The hum that had once symbolized ambition now manifested as the quiet pressure of survival. Professionally, the impact was equally severe. Opportunities vanished. Projects that had been in pre-production were canceled or postponed indefinitely. Streaming platforms removed content, citing public controversy, and collaborations once considered routine were now impossible. The man who had once shaped careers, mentored actors, and commanded sets found himself isolated from the very industry he had helped define. Every phone call, every email was weighed, a potential minefield of misunderstanding or renewed scrutiny. Emotionally, Clarke wrestled with conflicting narratives. On one hand, he maintained his innocence and believed that misrepresentation had fueled much of the backlash. On the other, he was confronted daily with the human consequences of his past behavior, the discomfort, fear, and distress expressed by colleagues and former collaborators. Reconciling these realities was a constant, sometimes painful process. He withdrew from public life almost entirely. Interviews, panels, and award ceremonies were replaced with solitary walks, quiet evenings, and hours spent revisiting scripts. Writing became a form of escape, though the words no longer carried the same lightness. They were scrutinized carefully, revised repeatedly, as though each sentence could be a defense in itself. Clarke's creative energy persisted, but it had transformed, slowed, tempered by caution and the weight of experience. Financially, the repercussions were significant. Lost projects meant lost income, and contractual obligations were suspended or rescinded. Clarke's production company, once a hub of opportunity, faced uncertainty. The resources and influence that had propelled him to prominence now had to be managed with extreme care. Every decision weighed against potential consequences in both the legal and public arenas. Socially, the impact was felt in subtle but persistent ways. Former collaborators who might have been casual acquaintances became distant, conversations truncated or avoided entirely. Invitations to events, networking opportunities, and professional gatherings disappeared. The hum of creative exchange, which had once filled his days with purpose and connection, now existed only as a memory. Psychologically, the burden was constant. Clarke spoke in private about feelings of anger, grief, and disbelief. He described nights spent imagining conversations, rehearsing statements, and replaying interactions from the past. The self-scrutiny was relentless, a mental echo chamber of what had been and what could never be recovered. Even minor social interactions carried the weight of potential judgment or misinterpretation. Despite the isolation, Clarke's survival instincts persisted. He sought legal counsel, carefully curated public statements, and maintained routines that offered structure in the chaos. Small victories, a favorable ruling on a procedural motion, a supportive message from a colleague, or completion of a creative project, provided brief reprieves, reminders that life could still move forward, however slowly. The consequences extended beyond the personal and professional. They rippled through the British film industry, sparking discussions on mentorship, power dynamics, and accountability. Clarke's experience became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the fragility of reputation and the consequences of blurred boundaries. Even as he navigated his own silence, he was a central figure in a broader cultural conversation about ethics, influence, and justice. As winter melted into spring, Clarke remained largely unseen. His life, once filled with the vibrancy of premieres, awards, and creative triumphs, had contracted into quiet reflection and careful management. The hum of ambition had not disappeared entirely. It had shifted. Now the persistent undertone of survival, vigilance, and the cautious hope that one day a narrative could emerge that reconciled his past with an uncertain future. The next chapter would confront not only his personal reckoning but the possibility of legacy. Whether redemption, reinvention, or permanent silence awaited the man who had once commanded the spotlight. Summer 2024. The sun hung low over London, casting long shadows across deserted studio lots and empty streets, and the faint scent of dust and heated asphalt clung to the city air. Noel Clarke stepped onto a soundstage, the echo of his own footsteps filling the cavernous space. It had been months since he had set foot in a professional environment like this. Every movement felt deliberate, every glance measured. The hum of the set, the buzz of lights, the subtle vibration of equipment was faint at first, then grew as he acclimated, reminding him of a life that once pulsed with unrestrained energy. Clarke had begun reaching out to collaborators cautiously, testing the waters of a possible return. Scripts he had written during isolation were polished and sent to trusted producers under conditions of confidentiality. Projects were proposed quietly, framed as creative exercises rather than public endeavors, designed to gauge interest without attracting immediate scrutiny. The strategy was deliberate: rebuild in the shadows before confronting public perception. Some industry figures responded. A few producers expressed tentative support, emphasizing his past contributions while noting the sensitivity of the situation. Others remained distant, unwilling to risk association. Each interaction carried the dual weight of opportunity and potential reputational hazard. Clarke's awareness of every consequence had sharpened to a fine edge. His ambition now coexisted with caution. The sound motif, the hum, was now literal in the studio. The gentle whirring of lights, cameras, and monitors providing both comfort and a reminder of expectation. Clarke walked the floor like a man reconnecting with a lost part of himself, remembering the intensity of creation and the thrill of collaboration. Yet even here, the shadow of public opinion lingered. Every step could be scrutinized, every word potentially quoted, every interaction assessed. Public commentary was a constant undertone. Social media continued to dissect each professional move, weighing the merits of his work against the allegations that had defined the previous years. Some applauded his resilience, framing any creative return as a testament to human determination. Others were unyielding, asserting that the past could not be undone by talent or vision. Clarke had learned to navigate this ambient tension, compartmentalizing judgment to focus on tangible progress. The first attempts at visibility were deliberately muted. Private screenings, limited workshops, and controlled interviews were used to test audience response. Feedback was scrutinized meticulously, every critique cataloged and analyzed. Clarke's humility in these interactions was strategic. He projected openness and professionalism, aware that the public's gaze could determine whether he would be allowed a second chance. Mentorship, once a hallmark of his career, became a focal point in his comeback strategy. Clarke worked with a small group of emerging actors and writers, emphasizing collaboration, consent, and mutual respect. These sessions were carefully documented, designed to demonstrate a conscious evolution in approach and to rebuild trust through action rather than rhetoric. The hum of creative collaboration returned, now intertwined with self-awareness and reflection. Yet, setbacks were frequent. Even minor miscommunications sparked renewed criticism. Journalists revisited past headlines, social media commenters dissected historical interviews, and advocacy groups monitored developments closely. Clarke's progress was never linear. Each small step forward was tempered by the knowledge that perception could reverse instantly. Despite these challenges, tangible achievements emerged. Scripts received positive internal feedback, short projects were greenlit for limited release, and trusted colleagues began to publicly acknowledge his creative skill while maintaining professional caution. Clarke navigated these successes with careful composure, understanding that any misstep could erase months of effort. The psychological impact remained. The hum, once a symbol of acclaim, now carried tension and vigilance. Clarke maintained routines, managing stress through structured work hours, exercise, and reflection. Social interactions remained measured. He had learned that survival in this environment required not just talent, but a disciplined awareness of boundaries, both his own and those of others. By late summer, whispers of a tentative resurgence had begun to circulate. The industry and public alike noted that Clarke was quietly, deliberately returning, not with the fanfare of his earlier career, but with caution, reflection, and a calculated sense of timing. The hum of opportunity had returned, but it was fragile, tempered by the lessons of scrutiny, accountability, and the consequences of past missteps. Even as Clarke began to reconstruct his career, he remained acutely aware of the fragility of his position. The next step would demand more than creative output. It would require navigating a world forever altered by allegations, public judgment, and the ongoing question of whether redemption was possible. The final chapter would examine that question, drawing his story toward closure while reflecting on legacy, consequences, and the possibility of reinvention. Autumn 2025. London's streets were lined with amber leaves, their crisp scent mixing with the faint smoke of wood fires and the distant tang of the Thames. Noel Clarke walked alone through a quiet park, the weight of years pressing into his shoulders. The hum that had once followed him, applause, cameras, excitement, was gone, replaced by the subtle vibration of reflection. Here, away from the cameras and headlines, he confronted the full measure of his journey. Fame, scandal, isolation, and the slow, painstaking effort to rebuild. Clarke's legacy was now a complicated tapestry. On one hand, his contributions to British cinema were undeniable. He had opened doors for underrepresented voices, created opportunities for emerging talent, and written stories that resonated with audiences across the country. His awards and accolades testified to a career once celebrated for innovation, charisma, and influence. Yet, intertwined with those achievements were the allegations, the public scrutiny, and the professional and personal consequences that followed. The hum of admiration had transformed into a resonant tension, a reminder that talent alone could never insulate a figure from accountability. He reflected on the women whose voices had catalyzed his fall. Their courage, their persistence, and their insistence on being heard had reshaped not only his story but the industry itself. Their narratives challenged power structures and demanded attention to boundaries and respect. Clarke, in private moments, grappled with the reality that impact, positive or negative, left traces that could not be erased. Every accolade now carried dual weight, recognition of skill and memory of controversy. Public opinion remained fragmented. Some continued to support him, viewing his efforts to return as evidence of resilience and creative brilliance. Others remained critical, unwilling to separate his achievements from the allegations. The hum of debate persisted, an ambient vibration across social media, news outlets, and industry corridors. Clarke had learned to navigate it, to listen without absorbing, to act without defiance, and to move carefully within a space that was both opportunity and minefield. In the quiet of his reflection, Clarke considered survival. His professional resurgence was cautious, incremental, and deliberate. He understood that true legacy was not simply the sum of accolades or projects completed, but the intersection of influence, accountability, and personal growth. The hum of creative energy, once external and overwhelming, had shifted inward, an internal rhythm guiding him through reconciliation and careful ambition. He also confronted the personal cost. Relationships, trust, and intimacy had been tested, altered, and sometimes severed. Loneliness remained a constant companion, tempered by the few connections that had endured scrutiny and time. The stakes of each interaction, each collaboration, and each public statement were clear. Every action now carried consequences far beyond the immediate moment. Yet, in that same space, there was possibility. Clarke had begun mentoring young creatives with a conscious focus on consent, respect, and ethical collaboration. He had completed private projects that reflected his vision while maintaining discretion. He had begun the slow, deliberate work of reclaiming agency over his career, one careful decision at a time. The hum now carried hope, tempered by the lessons of scrutiny and accountability. Legacy, Clarke realized, was never singular. It was a constellation of achievements, failures, and the echoes left behind in the lives of others. He could not undo the past, nor fully control perception, but he could shape the narrative of his present actions and future contributions. Fame, once a beacon, had become a tool for reflection, a reminder that influence carries both opportunity and responsibility. Walking along the path, leaves crunching underfoot, Clarke felt the hum shift again, softer, steadier. The public eye would continue to observe, to debate, and to remember selectively. Yet his own awareness had sharpened. Redemption was neither granted nor guaranteed, but it could be pursued through deliberate action, accountability, and consistent effort. The story of Noel Clarke was no longer one of uninterrupted ascent. It was a complex, sobering reflection on power, fame, and consequence. A cautionary tale woven into the fabric of British cinema and cultural conversation. And in that quiet hum, he recognized that survival, understanding, and the measured pursuit of legacy were victories in themselves. Even as the world moved on, Clarke moved forward, cautiously, deliberately, aware that every step carried weight and every decision shaped how history would remember him. And for those who followed stories of rise and fall, success and consequence, the lesson remained clear. Talent alone cannot shield one from accountability, and the echoes of choices reverberate far beyond the spotlight. In the quiet streets, with the hum of the city around him, Clarke continued, careful, reflective, and alive in a world that had once both celebrated and condemned him. If you found this deep dive into the complexities of fame, consequence, and human resilience compelling, take a moment to watch more of our stories and subscribe to follow our explorations of truth in modern culture.